Turn to Titus chapter 2. In fact, if you want to look at the chapter backward, it starts and ends with the same idea. Look at verse 15. Paul tells his son in the faith, his mentored young pastor friend Titus this. Verse 15, speak these things, exhort, rebuke with all authority. Let no one despise you. And then he started in verse 1 with the same idea. But as for you, speak the things which are proper. He said this is so vital. This was God's plan for penetrating the dark Roman culture of mixed up everything. He said, I want you to go out empowered by my grace. That's verses 11, 12, and 13. And see these people deny their whole culture, deny their whole upbringing, deny the whole way they were raised, and go my way. This is a very exciting passage. It's not just for the older women that we're looking at, verses 3, 4, and 5. It's for all of us. And I would encourage you, if you've never looked at Titus 2 as your marching orders for how we are to take the gospel out and transform the world, one person at a time, that maybe the Lord will stir your heart in that way. Well, when the gospel of the life-changing grace of Jesus Christ, that's verses 11, 12, and 13 of chapter 2, entered the Roman world of the New Testament, the conditions of family life were very bleak. In fact, the family was very, very much under attack, more so than even in our day, in the ancient paganism of the Roman world. That paganism had all but erased the plans that God had left for marriage and the family. And so, when the Church of Jesus Christ was deployed into that world and began sharing His grace, Christian marriages and homes began to be started. Now think about this. In a world where sin had warped the very culture, where sin had confused and messed up the very people that were supposed to establish these Christian homes. And so, into a sin-darkened world of mixed-up marriages and sin-scarred lives and confused families, the glorious, gracious work of Jesus Christ began. Men didn't know their role as men in the home and the church. Women didn't understand their gender-specific roles in the home and the church. Husbands had never heard about servant leadership. Women had never even seen or heard about the gracious, Spirit-energized submission that was to be modeled for them by their mothers or anyone else they knew. They had not had that exposure. So how did Paul deal with that? Kind of sounds like our modern day, doesn't it, as the gospel goes out? Well, the grace that Titus 2, 1 through 13 offered empowered the believers to overcome every level of the culture that the New Testament world surrounding them had begun to be, this culture, antagonistic. And they had to overcome every level of culture antagonistic against the Christian home and the Christian family. Sometimes we don't think about how hard it was. We so often are myopic. We think of our own world and all of our struggles. They had just incredible obstacles to the Christian home. And so I think about the history. First, the Old Testament Jewish culture. That's, remember, where the gospel began, right there in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, right in the Holy Land. The Old Testament Jewish culture had moved away from God's plan for marriage in the home. They had expanded the divorce provisions of Deuteronomy 24 to include anything a husband didn't like. So they could get a legit temple-approved divorce for anything. And the stories are unbelievable to read about. You know, anything from burning the toast to not looking pretty enough. They just divorced them. By Christ's day, divorce was commonplace and expected. Many men felt that women were only an object to be used, and a common prayer that survived through the centuries contained the following words, which really reflected the culture's perception of women. And this was the prayer: God, I thank you I'm not a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. But you know, grace taught those believers to deny that ungodliness and improper belief. Secondly, the secular Greek culture, and that's what Alexander the Great had basically imposed upon the whole civilized world. It had influenced the world before the New Testament times and decimated the place of women. In Greek society, men were allowed to have concubines, consorts, maintained wives only for legitimate children. That was the culture. You had a legitimate wife for legitimate heirs for legal purposes, but that's it. And so, culturally, Across the pagan world, women were considered to be little more than servants. But grace, God's grace, taught the early church to deny that error. Finally, in the first century Roman world, like Crete was a part of the Greco-Roman world of the first century Roman world and that society, which had been built upon the Greek society, plunged the family even deeper into darkness. Divorce became widespread, and as the affluence, the great materialistic Roman culture with all of its conquests and all the wealth, as it increased, as affluence increased, family life decreased. And many women of the Roman world chose to not even have children because it would ruin their looks of their bodies. And so grace, again, taught them when they were saved to deny this error. So how would you reach a culture like that? How would you reach a culture that had the Bible and turned from it, that had this Greek influence, this paganism that said the family is nothing and that you're just to live for pleasure, and then the Roman society that promoted the total dissolution of family and marriage with serial divorce? What was God's plan? To penetrate such an antagonistic culture. How would God get his gospel to the furthest corner of the Roman world of Paul's day? The plan was simple. Titus 2 says, God would pour out his saving grace. His grace would change people from the inside out. See, that's the wonderful gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not getting enough external influences on a person to prop them up and change them. It's not getting them to enough classes and with enough support that finally they'll be propped up and they can kind of become a little pillar in society. It's an internal life transformation. It's God giving us a new operating system, a new heart. And so God says, I'm going to pour out my grace and change people from the inside outward. And I'm going to transform society that way. And so God's plan was his grace would be taught, modeled, and exhibited by Paul and Titus, and that would produce matured believers. But it didn't stop there. That's how we got to this. It wasn't the professional level, the professional missionary church planner, Paul, that was heavily involved in what needed to be done. It wasn't his just specially trained Titus, his top lieutenant. It moved down from there right into the very individual lives of the church. And that's what we're seeing in verses 3 and 4, as it's what individual godly believers, particularly women, were supposed to do to influence the culture. Because steeped in a family-unfriendly culture, men and women who were gloriously saved did not automatically become great wives and mothers or husbands and fathers. You think about that. They didn't just listen to Paul's sermon and say, yes, I want Jesus, and then walk out being this perfect, exemplary husband and father. It didn't happen that way. It doesn't happen that way today. It's a process from the inside out of us learning, Titus 2:11, to deny ungodliness. And so they were being taught what they needed to deny. And so God graciously gave them everything they needed to become godly wives and mothers, husbands and fathers, but they needed something else. After their salvation, they needed regular gathering together in the corporate meetings of the church, the worship services. And they needed to be taught, and they needed to worship, and they needed to have proper doctrine. But it didn't end there. This passage takes us to the next level, the level where everyone participates. They needed the gracious, life-changing work of the Spirit of God in marriages and families to be lived out and modeled for them. And that's what this chapter is about. Godly mentoring, modeling, disciple-making of individuals. And so Paul tells Titus to call for matured believers to disciple these new converts in how to behave correctly. Not just believe right, behave on a daily level. Those mature, godly women would each find a younger woman in the church. They would spend time with her, teaching her how to change her attitude, her marriage, and her family. These new believers needed coaching, they needed training, they needed modeling, they needed encouraging in a one-on-one relationship. Godly behavior is a series of choices, and these men and women had to be nurtured in the daily skills that would lead to a loving marriage. Can you imagine in a dark world how bright a loving husband-wife relationship would be? How radically just transformational it would be to have a mother that had this godly home in the midst of a pagan dark culture. See, this was a groundbreaking move to go into specifically the island of Crete with its history of human sacrifice and horrible paganism. And many Bible scholars believe that those mean old Philistines, as in Goliath of Gath, were the sea peoples that had left Crete and invaded the Holy Land in the 14th century BC and the 15th century BC and the 13th century and became those Philistines. So if you want to know what Titus's congregation was, think of Goliath, okay? That's who he was facing with. The relatives, the forebears, the ancestors of Goliath and the Philistines were the people that were still living on Crete. And he says, I want to change this island one person at a time as God's grace pours into their life. And all of a sudden, as they began to be mentored in the grace of God lived out in a marriage, in parenting, in a home, and in life of that society. Modeling seems to be among the big dreams of many young ladies in our culture today. But the best and most rewarding modeling career is with God. The spiritual shape of a woman is what matters eternally, not her physical shape. And godly modeling with God gives rewards that last forever. And that's the vital spiritual mentoring ministry we find captured in Titus 2. Christ Church using coaches in godly living. And that church from Crete and across the ancient New Testament world grew into the potent force for changing the world in those quiet, nurturing sessions that Titus 2 men and women performed in practical discipleship. Just as important as Titus's preaching and teaching the doctrines of God's Word were the modeling and nurturing of individual saints through the practical hands-on lessons that these older men and older women were to perform.